In the 21st century, the news media and social media landscapes have undergone seismic shifts. These changes have altered how we perceive and engage with the world around us, quite often to our detriment. Today, outrage is not just an emotion, it is a product, a commodity to be packaged, marketed, and sold to a public hungry for stimulation. This is the story of how both traditional and digital media have turned outrage into a systemic business model, creating a culture where outrage is constant, deepening societal divisions, and undermining democratic discourse. The concept of outrage as a commodity isn't new, of course, but its scale and reach have transformed radically in the digital era. News organizations, struggling to adapt to the digital age, have embraced a strategy that prioritizes emotionally charged content to attract clicks and shares. According to a 2019 study by the Pew Research Center, roughly 55% of adults in the United States often or sometimes get their news from social media platforms, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. This shift has incentivized news outlets to frame stories in the most provocative terms possible, as they compete for attention in an ever more saturated market. The algorithms that drive social media are designed to maximize user engagement, and studies show that outrage-inducing content is particularly effective in this regard. Researchers at New York University and Princeton University found that posts expressing outrage were 17% more likely to be shared on social media platforms than those with a more measured tone. This, my friends, is not an accident. It's a feature. Algorithms prioritize content that triggers strong emotional responses, such as anger, fear, and indignation, as these emotions keep users engaged longer, allowing more ads to be shown and increasing profitability. Traditional news outlets have increasingly adopted the tactics of their digital counterparts. The phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, has become, if it provokes, it profits. Clickbait headlines are now the norm, and many news outlets have resorted to publishing sensationalized stories with little regard for accuracy or depth. A 2020 analysis of online news headlines by the American Press Institute revealed that 64% of headlines for major news outlets used some form of sensational language to draw in readers. This is a clear departure from the more nuanced reporting of the previous decades, which has been sacrificed on the altar of virality. Moreover, as newsrooms have faced budget cuts and declining advertising revenue, the pressure to produce stories that generate immediate clicks has all but intensified. The result is a proliferation of headlines and stories designed to stoke controversy with a focus on conflict and divisiveness over context and understanding. The incentives are skewed towards generating as much attention as possible, even if that means distorting facts or presenting information in a way that is deliberately misleading. The consequences of today's media environment extend far beyond the realm of journalism. We live in a world where every swipe or scroll brings us face to face with content that is engineered to provoke anger or frustration. A 2021 survey conducted by the American Psychological Association found that 84% of Americans reported feeling stressed due to political and societal issues, with many citing the media's role in amplifying conflicts. This stress isn't just a personal burden. It has real societal implications. The constant barrage of anger-inducing content creates a feedback loop of emotional escalation. A 2018 study published in Nature found that exposure to online outrage can increase the likelihood that users will post their own outrage-filled content, perpetuating a cycle of hostility. This leads to a culture of hyperpolarization, where people are less willing to engage with differing viewpoints, and instead retreat into ideological echo chambers that reinforce their pre-existing beliefs. As a result, we've seen a sharp rise in polarization in the United States. According to the Pew Research Center, the percentage of Americans who hold consistently liberal or consistently conservative views doubled between 1994 and 2017, reflecting a growing divide between political ideologies. It is difficult these days to voice an opinion or even ask an innocent question that strays from the party line for fear that we will be shamed or outright canceled by the same people we cling to as our allies. The erosion of public trust in media is another devastating outcome of the outrage economy. A Gallup poll from 2022 showed that only 34% of Americans trust the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. And given the quality of today's reporting, I find the idea that 66% of Americans still trust the media to be utterly alarming. Our distrust of news from sources that, by all rights, should be trustworthy has been exacerbated by the proliferation of misinformation, much of which is driven by platforms that prioritize engagement over truth. In this environment, it's easy to see how misinformation can become a potent tool for division. Social media has, after all, become a bleeding ground for conspiracy theories and falsehoods, and with quite disastrous effects. A 2020 study by MIT found that false news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true ones, indicating just how quickly misinformation can spread through social media networks. When falsehoods are designed to provoke anger or outrage, their reach extends even further. This leads to a fractured public sphere, where people are quick to accuse each other of ill intent, undermining the possibility of finding common ground. The media's focus on outrage has contributed to a sense of societal disintegration, where it's not just institutions, but also our fellow citizens that we've come to distrust. We see our neighbors not as people with different perspectives, but as our adversaries. This dynamic is particularly evident in the context of political divisions. The 2021 American Perspective Survey found that nearly 60% of Americans believe that members of the opposing political party pose a threat to the nation's well-being, up significantly from previous decades. This isn't merely the result of ideological differences. It's a direct outcome of a media landscape that thrives on portraying our political opponents as enemies rather than fellow citizens. The media industry's embrace of outrage is not merely a byproduct of digital transformation. It's a conscious business strategy. As platforms like Facebook and Twitter monetize user engagement through advertising, their profitability is directly tied to keeping users on their sites for as long as possible. And outrage is a reliable means to that end. A report from the University of California, Berkeley found that online ads generate more revenue when paired with articles that elicit strong emotional responses, like anger or, be it, fear. This creates a perverse incentive structure where platforms benefit financially from stoking societal tensions. Facebook's own internal research, leaked in 2021, revealed that the company's algorithms often promoted division and sensational content because it drove engagement, even if that meant spreading misinformation or exacerbating social conflicts. And this is not just a problem for social media companies. It has influenced traditional media as well, creating a race to the bottom where the loudest and most extreme voices are rewarded, while those calling for nuance and understanding are drowned out. Addressing the crisis of outrage requires a fundamental rethinking of how media operates in the digital age. It begins with recognizing that journalism's role should be to inform, not inflame. News outlets need to prioritize accurate and balanced reporting, even if it comes at the expense of short-term clicks. This might involve restructuring advertising models to reward quality over quantity, focusing on subscriptions or public funding, models that are not dependent on the virality of sensational stories. We as consumers share responsibility in the demise of reliable reporting because of our why buy the cow when we can get the milk for free mentalities. It's hard to find room in our already tight budgets to support news organizations when the internet will supply us with information charge free. But this cost-saving system has led to a suckling from the teat that only produces spoiled milk. Social media companies, too, bear a responsibility. They must adjust their algorithms to prioritize trustworthy information and penalize content that is deliberately misleading or inflammatory. This would involve greater transparency in how algorithms operate and a willingness to forgo some short-term profits for the long-term health of public discourse and the long-term health of democracy. But ultimately, the solution also lies with us, the consumers of media. We need to recognize our own role in perpetuating the cycle of outrage. Every time we click on a sensational headline or share a post that confirms our biases, we reinforce the economic incentives that drive the outraged economy. It is up to us to demand better from both news outlets and social media platforms, to value depth and nuance over sensationalism, and to seek out information that challenges rather than comforts our preconceived notions. The constant churn of outrage is unsustainable. It is eroding trust in our institutions, fracturing our communities, and weakening our democracy. If we continue down this path, the consequences will be dire. A society so deeply divided that it loses the ability to function as a democracy. To build a healthier society, we must challenge the business models and incentive structures that have turned anger into a commodity. This means pushing for media reform, demanding greater accountability from social media platforms, and cultivating our own resilience against the siren call of outrage. If we can change course, if we can reclaim the power of media as a tool for truth rather than division, well, we have the potential to build a more informed, empathetic, and united society. And that was the not so final word up front, because our guest today knows much more about the topics I touched upon in my monologue. David Beckemeyer is here to talk with us about the broad consequences of political outrage and to share practical strategies for us to manage our own outrage and emotion constructively in politics. I'm Sean Sainhart, and this is Coup Save America. We'll be right back after the break. David Beckemeyer is the host of Outrage Overload, a podcast dedicated to exploring the outrage industry and finding solutions to toxic polarization. Through interviews with leading experts, David aims to uncover the roots of political outrage and provide actionable strategies for promoting civil discourse and understanding. David's show aims to help listeners identify not only the reasons why we find ourselves drawn to outrage media, but also how to lift ourselves out of this spiral and contribute to lowering the temperature and fostering civil discourse. And David joins us right now. Hello, David.
Hi, Sean.
So how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Oh, I'm doing okay.
Good.
So I wanted to ask you, and this might be a self-evident question, but I wanted to ask you, how did the idea for Outrage Overload come about? And what was the turning point that made you realize political outrage needed deeper exploration?
Yeah, so it's very, it does have a personal story to it. So, I mean, a lot of us have these kinds of stories, but you sort of had the 2016 election and things were heating up then, and you saw a lot of people, kind of getting in fights or breaking off relationships, and uncle, can't come to Thanksgiving anymore, and you see people on Facebook disconnecting with longtime friends and family and so on. And I saw all that going on in my life, and then I saw, closer and closer relationships. Doing those sort of things, right, and getting upset over politics and breaking relationships, and those were a couple of the biggies. And there were, there's no single straw, but it just kept building and building and building. But one of the ones was my son, who's pretty active on social media, or was, sort of got off social media, and that kind of surprised me. I was like, "Why'd you get off social media?" And he kind of told his story about how he was finding himself just getting embroiled in these arguments. That at some point weren't even about the argument anymore. It was just about It wasn't about the issues of the argument. It was just about, I want to see if I can keep I can win this argument. I can keep them riled up. He almost became like acting like a troll, almost got sucked into it. And I'm a guy I was out there getting in Twitter fights as well with people. And then it's sort of like, that just kind of said, let's take a step back from this and what's going on out there. And sort of being a bit of a science nerd myself, then that sort of caused me to say, well, I think there's a lot of research going on in this space, and we can maybe bring some of that research to light and kind of talk about this. And I figure, well, I'm just a layman. I'll take listeners on this journey with me to kind of go explore this topic. Like, why are we like this? Why are we letting this happen to us?
And what was the reason that you found?
Well, unfortunately, there's not any super single one thing. Like, we all
Right.
kind of want it's Colonel Mustard with the candlestick, in the library, and it's nothing's quite that simple. It's a lot of the things you talked about in the opening there, where it's just kind of just confluence of many things, right? You've had sort of 60 or 70 years of this kind of building and escalating. So it's kind of a whole bunch of things. The media incentives you talked about, sort of the growth of social media, and that's a whole new way to communicate that our brains like aren't really ready for. And so that just got, and there was nobody like sort of said, well, we should probably do it like this and really be, control this and think about the sociology and psychology of it. Oh no, we just like jump in, right? So
Yeah.
and we really haven't, our brains really haven't figured out that. So I got the social media part, and so there's just all these pieces of it that have added up to create this sort of polarized environment that then is like you were saying in the intro as well, is kind of just self-feeding, right? We act that way, we put ourselves in a deeper bubble, we get more hostile to the other side and less open to perspectives. We also get less practice being uncomfortable, right? And having a conversation, because we're in our bubble so much, we're less comfortable when somebody says something that doesn't match like what we usually expected. Everyone, we're all getting along, we're all cheerleading for each other, and somebody says one thing that's like, well, that's not what all of the rest of us think, and we're not used to that discomfort and sort of having those conversations and pushing through that. So it really throws us off when that happens. And sometimes that's enough. Like that person's, like you were saying, is canceled, like they're out because they said this one thing.
Now, Donald Trump has contributed significantly to this culture of outrage, I would say, but I would blame both parties for this. Is that an accurate statement, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump certainly manifests or highlights or is a catalyst for a lot of the
Right.
things, but he didn't create the division. He just really knew how to take advantage of it. I mean, he's sort of you have to
Capitalize
give
on
him
it.
credit. I mean, he's an amazing propagandist. I mean, he's an
Yes.
amazing salesman, or whatever whether you want to call it, con artist or salesman, one or the other. Sort of he's really good at tapping into those emotions. He's really good at selling those ideas and figuring. He beat all the pundits to where a big chunk of America was, and nobody thought that was there, but he saw it, and but he didn't create it. He just took advantage of it, and he's still doing that, right? I mean, that's kind of his thing. So I see him as a symptom and a bit of a cause as well. But I think if Donald Trump went away tomorrow, these problems wouldn't go
Oh,
away, right?
right. I agree
You know,
with that 100%.
yeah. I
100.
mean, this is a generational problem that we've built up here. This is going to take a while to A, really get a good handle on it, and B, then start to see, start to actually take action, because it really goes against a lot of our innate psychology now, and it's built up so strong. These incentives you talk about are so powerful now. Media incentives, for politicians, they like this world too because it simplifies their life. If they can spend most of their time telling us how evil the other person is, they don't really have to worry about policy or much else. They can just have that one main message: the other person is terrible, so vote for me. And they don't really have to be very accountable. So politicians kind of like it this way. It simplifies their world. News media likes it because they can bring on these very, kind of, you come on, they want you to take the strongest opinion you're willing to take and sort of stick to it. They don't want that nuanced conversation, right? They want that um,
Yeah.
polarization. And so, yeah, all those incentives are there. And as you mentioned in the intro as well, is it does come back on us because we're the consumers, we're the product, and we're the ones creating that market for that content. So it's a two-way street there, because obviously we were sort of drawn into it, but then we still want it. So it's a thing that we're often not even aware of. Like we aren't even necessarily aware that we like this content. We like to be infuriated by the other side because it boosts our sort of moral superiority.
Right.
Like we're on the good team if they keep showing us how terrible people on the other side are. And that's happening whatever side you're on. You're seeing that kind of content in your world. So you just get this reinforcing picture that the other side is not only wrong in their thinking, they're immoral, and evil.
Or
And
evil. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And you start to believe that. And that's where things start to get really dangerous, because now that's how you become comfortable with dehumanizing people, and where you sort of anything becomes fair game because I'm on the morally righteous side, and it says that anything's justified at that point. And that's where things are now. That's why I talk about lowering the temperature, because whether you're in the field of trying to create, and I'm not I'm not the one out there trying to do the find common ground and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of people in that world. I'm like a step back from that, even sort of just saying, first step is we have to accept that the other side can think rationally and has some ethics and some morals, right? And they're humans, and because right now this is a fundamental problem. We don't think the other side knows how to think. Like, we don't think they can put together a logical argument. And so, well, at that point, how can we have those other dialogues about common ground and all that stuff if we don't even believe that they can think in a rational way? So that's almost the first layer, is kind of getting that message out there, that we've got to unravel from that. It's like, it seems like such a low bar, right? But it actually is kind of a hard thing to do, because we've just become that way. And you see this, in social media conversations, you see it all the time. So, we're exhibiting it, but we just don't realize it because it's the forest for the trees, or whatever sort of metaphor you want to throw out there. We can't see it when we're doing it. I do these what I call kind of man on the street interviews, where I just, it's mostly about active listening. So I mostly just ask people questions and listen to their answers, and I don't push back. I might try to get clarity on what they're saying, but I don't sort of react to it and go like, wow, that's a really crazy thing to say. No one would say that. And once that starts happening, that they don't get that reaction, people are very not used to that, right? It's like a world they're not used to, where someone just lets them explain their situation or their position and their viewpoint and isn't pushing back. So you start to see them open up more and become more, willing to share these experiences. They probably don't share it with some of their best friends because they're afraid that this might be more than they want to hear. So it's interesting to see how we've become, sort of, we have all these feelings, but we don't want to say them. And it's kind of funny that we've had this long conversation back and forth a little bit about things like the outrage media, and that we get, ask questions about that, and things like, well, the other side sometimes says this, or your side, and then they'll more or less say, yeah, I know this outrage media is terrible because the other side's awful, or it's like, it just goes straight to that. Like, they don't even see that they're sort of doing the thing we were just talking about. You're doing it right now, and we just don't see it in ourselves. And I'm sure I do it too, right? We all do it,
right? Well, it's part of being human.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's unfortunately where we are. I want to ask, this culture of outrage, is this specific to the United States, or do you see this as a global phenomena?
Well, I think if you go back, you can go back in history and find this kind of rhetoric has been there like forever, right? I think, you could see these kind of arguments were happening a long time ago. So it's not like outrage isn't like a new vehicle we suddenly have. And I don't think it's completely unique to the US. I think we've got a bunch of stuff going on here that contribute to it, that kind of contribute to this very binary view of the world. We've got two parties, we've got sort of gerrymandering, we've got, so we've got some things that maybe exacerbate it here, but it's happening in other countries as well. Some of these same kind of things. I mean, I think, maybe if there's an American exceptionalism, maybe it is we're crazier on the outrage side a little bit, and we really like it more. I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be completely unique to us. No, like you say, I think it's more of a human trait, but it's all this kind of confluence of these many things that have, made all of this, a kind of a big problem now. Like, I think, the best news about that I've learned about the show is there's a lot of people that recognize this is a real problem, and there's a lot of smart brains working on it, way smarter than me, that we can hopefully kind of start coming up with some things. But so that's like the biggest bit of hope I have, is that there's a lot of smart people looking at this problem and seeing it as a real problem.
Part of the problem with it is that I think everybody recognizes that there's a problem. The issue seems to be the cultural aspects. I mean, like I talked about in the monologue, the media that focuses on this, the social media, but there's also that sense, at least in America, where the other side is the enemy. And we hear constant rhetoric about threats to democracy, threats to our safety. I mean, already we've seen, 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump. We've had just recently threats against FEMA officials from armed militias. It seems to me that the temperature is rising rather quickly, and I don't know what to expect next. Do you think that we're at a level where we could be facing some sort of a civil war type of situation?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's a very interesting thing because when you talk to a lot of the political scientists, they tend to have a lot of faith in our institutions, and especially if they're sort of focused on the American situation, they really have a faith in our institutions that they'll hold, and we'll get through this and this kind of thing. If you talk to people that study internationally, they're more of the thinking that institutions hold until they don't. We've seen this movie before. Right. And so they're a little bit more pessimistic about it, to be honest with you, that maybe these institutions won't hold. I mean, I try to be optimistic about it, but I think that's an important thing we all have to spend more energy on. I think we don't give our institutions enough credit. As much as we complain about how terrible some of these things are, I mean, we really have to realize how good a lot of it is, and how much of it is more of a, they need improvements and this kind of thing, but tearing them all down is not the answer, right? These institutions are really hard to build. So, I think, I doubt the idea of a civil war with, borders like happened, in the 19th century is going to happen, from what I can hear, at least. And I have to be careful that I'm not an expert. I'm just kind of parroting what I've read and heard and spoken with experts about. It looks more like, but things like isolated, incidents, I think, well, as you know, they're practically already happening now. But right. Yeah, I think that's a more likely scenario. Something like what we saw in Texas was kind of a scary precursor, where for a while they were kind of have that standoff with the Border Patrol, and then a couple of other states sent National Guard folks down to help to work with Greg Abbott, and you kind of had this weird coalition of militias kind of standing off against the federal officers down there. I think that's kind of the thing I think is the kind of, maybe that's a direction things could go. And of course, I also think a lot of information warfare, which we're already suffering from, but I think we could see more of that. I mean, I think there's a lot of risk there. Attacks on infrastructure through technology, and online attacks and things like that, attacks through banking. And I think there's a lot of risks there. But yeah, I mean, if you look at this rhetoric, there are a lot of people that seem, even some of those interviews that I do one-on-one with people, I mean, some of these people, and they, that's another thing I learned from that. Everybody considers themselves kind of the middle, like they're the reasonable, sane one, and everybody else is kind of extreme. And yet some of these people, if you were to take this kind of in a, I don't know, as independent of an observer as you could find, as you all, you talk about, and I talk about a lot, nobody's completely unbiased, but as sort of a bunch of independent observers as you could be, they would position that person pretty extreme, right? But they consider themselves, kind of the normal one, and everybody else is extreme. But I've had people in those interviews that are like, I would say they're about that close, to a armed insurrection of some kind. That's how mad they are. And, and it's hard for me to grasp. I have to admit, sometimes, a lot of times I'm the observer of all this, like everybody else. And I'm just kind of, I mean, like other, that like real academics, but I see myself more as an observer. And that's a good mindset to put yourself in, by the way. It can really help sometimes when you watch the news as sort of an outside observer, as opposed to an affected citizen. but at the same time, then I also find myself as a participant in it, right? And then sometimes then I'm right back in it a little bit myself. Despite everything I've learned, it's still a hard psychology to not fall into, right? And so, yeah, you can have this, it can be difficult, and you talk about how one of our problems is the other side is so evil. That's, again, we talked about how that justifies this kind of really, this is where you get into these, really, really bad things, right? That's how you end up with sort of just a feeling like a civil war is the best answer. But it's hard for me to grasp, as much as I've studied the psychology and sort of in the abstract, I know, or I should know, but it's, as a regular person in a practical sense, on the feet on the ground, I still can't understand how we think things are that bad, like that we're ready to tear it all down and blow it all up. It's like, have you actually seen what that looks like when you do that? Like, do you, we have a mostly functioning democracy where elections are pretty real, they're pretty valid. You don't see much fraud, hardly any. You know, that we have free and fair elections for the most part. There's lots of little fighting around, but there are a lot of lawsuits and a lot of organizations kind of fighting to keep that election system good. So, you know, it's pretty solid still. The judicial system is still pretty solid. People complain a little bit about the current Supreme Court. It's not the first time we've had this kind of thing in the Supreme Court. So that is mostly held. I mean, obviously the legislative branch is kind of broken, but that comes back to our political toxic polarization and this world we're in where everybody wants to sort of dominate and they can't. So we're in this world that it's a very fractured world. And so we have to just learn how to live with each other better. So that makes that part pretty broken. But for the most part, things mostly, you know, are in pretty good shape. Like the economy is actually pretty good, yet we think it's terrible. So it's odd for me to understand how we think things are so bad that we think something like a civil war we're ready to have that. And again, I you know, I listen to all these experts, you know, the psychology around it, you know, does have that, like, you actually have come to believe these other people just don't deserve to be in power, right? They practically don't deserve to be in the same country with us, right? And that's kind of where a lot of people are. They're like, you know, but it's still, I still don't get it, like why we think that we need to tear it all down and have a civil war. I just don't understand it.
Yeah, well, I understand the anger part of it, because it's hard not to be angry at a lot of the stuff that's going on in the country right now. You mentioned the Supreme Court. They're doing some dangerous things. The Chevron doctrine that they've overruled, reversing Roe v. Wade. We've seen the ramifications of that, and I don't know that institution is being upheld as something that's healthy for our democracy. It seems like we've been taken over by corporate interests, and this I blame on both parties. And
right,
it just seems like everything is falling apart. And I recognize it in saying that I'm a little optimistic that you're optimistic. And I've enjoyed your podcast very much, by the way. I just listened to your latest episode on about being an environmental saint yesterday. I finally got around to that episode. And one of the things that I like about your podcast is that you are optimistic, and you have people on there that are really insightful and bring a lot of depth to the issues. But on the other hand, I've disconnected from the news altogether. You know, I try to get my news from independent sources, and it's utterly just depressing. And I have a depressive personality, so that obviously doesn't help. But it does feel like our institutions are failing, and maybe that's not the case, but that's certainly the feeling that exists in the mainstream. And I wonder how we overcome that feeling to recognize, well, no, things are actually working pretty well.
Yeah, it can be a little hard for sure, because like you say, you can certainly cite challenges that we face. I'm certainly not saying things are perfect, right? I'm certainly saying they could be a lot worse. And we have challenges. I mean, I think one of the challenges you have about, if you take the institution of journalism, that, you know, it's a challenge out there. There's more good information than there's ever been. That's for sure. There's more good journalism than there's ever been. But unfortunately, there's way more bad journalism, and, you know, kind of finding that good in the bad and figuring out what you're looking at and whether it's good or bad has become a big challenge. And that's more lift than any normal person wants to do. Yeah. Right. And so, you know, there are some tools you can use, I think, that will help, you know, steer you towards better quality stuff. Things like Other Web is an interesting tool to look at. There's a newsletter called 1440 News that's pretty good about, you know, gives you a nice summary at the each day, and then it refers to articles that are, you know, less sensationalized, have been vetted, you know, by their team. And so some tools like that can help, you know, reduce the amount of overhead and lift there is to go find good content. So there's some tools like that that can really help. But yeah, I don't blame people. I mean, even though, I mean, there was a time when I was that person that said, you got out of the news. Well, now you're an uninformed citizen and you're a bad person. You know, I was kind of that person, right? Now I totally get it. Like, I totally get why people feel like it's just overwhelming. Like, I don't know what to do here. There's, you know, because you get a plethora of issues with news. Even a good, there's no such thing as a good 100% good journal or either, right? I mean, because
Right.
even a good publication puts out some bad stuff, and vice versa. Even, like, you know, there's probably some good Breitbart articles. You know, I don't know for sure where they are, but I bet there are some good Breitbart articles. But, you know, and just like, you know, and also like the Washington Examiner, a lot of people may think, well, they're bad and their editorials are pretty terrible, but they actually put out pretty good news if you just look at the news. So, you know, and again, even, you know, the best publication can put out some bad stuff, and sometimes it's not even factually wrong or anything like that. Sometimes it just has bad logic, just wasn't researched well or something like that, right? I don't really buy into that. There's a lot of, you know, kind of a conspiracy. They're trying to, you know, manipulate us. I think there's some of that, because sometimes who owns these publications and yada,
Right.
yada, you kind of follow that path. But for the most part, your average journalist is just a college grad journalist who wants to do good work. But sometimes they give a deadline, sometimes something else, and they just aren't exposed to all the right material. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that can make something less than fully there. Plus, you know, and when there is sometimes an agenda, what you're often finding is less lying, like outright lying, but maybe some stuff got left out, right? And almost always when you see a story that's really getting really getting you riled up, that's probably the time to step back and say there probably is more to this story, because those are the articles, are these sensational ones we're talking about, right? They're trying to spin it in a way to kind of get you afraid and upset, and probably there's more of that story. And this is true both left and right. Like, I could probably cite larger examples on the right, but it's happening left and right. Nobody has a monopoly on that kind of reporting, right? So journalism is a tough one because of that, right? Because there is great journalism out there, but it kind of is hard to find. It gets lost, and it's too much of a burden for the average person to go find that good journalism. You know, in some ways we had that heyday, or we talks about, of sort of the 60s and 70s with kind of the Walter Cronkite thing. And some of that was just a limitation on how much, you know, there was 3 channels.
Right.
They did half an hour of news every night, right? So it was very, you know, curated. And we don't have that now. We just have this wide open playing field, and it's very hard to discriminate and tell them apart. It really, you know, because you don't need much to have. You put a good font around it and a couple of pretty colors, and it looks the same as any other publication. So it's very hard to vet these things and figure out what their sources are. And some of that, you know, you can go take media training, but is the average person going to? We're
Right.
expecting the average person to have to do that. Like, that's a big ask, right?
Well, and part of the problem is, I mean, we've got the corporate media that, I mean, I think if you look at all the newspapers, magazines, news networks, I think that the last time I checked, it was like 5 companies that own the majority of our news. And so that's why I lean more to independent sources. But no, that is very difficult. It's very time consuming. I mean, putting together the show, for instance, you know, going through all the independent sources. I mean, you've got paywalls that you have to go through, and I get it. These independent journalists need to make a living, right? So, you know, you've got these subscription models where it's $5 for a month for this one, or $10 a month for this one. But you have to find them. Oftentimes you have to pay for them. And it takes a lot of time, unfortunately. Now, I have that time, but as you said, the average person does not. So they're stuck with mostly mainstream news sources. And I mean, CNN is on the verge of bankruptcy for the most part. I mean, they've just moved to a subscription model on their website to supplement their income. And that advertising model is really part of the problem, because advertisers want a certain type of narrative to be addressed. And if you step outside that narrative, well, you lose advertising revenue. And so I wonder, what recommendations do you have for the average news consumer out there to sort of overcome some of the biases that exist, and some of the narrative journalism that we've discussed?
Yeah. Well, I want to note one thing before I go there, but one thing you were talking about, how there's paywalls on these, you know, independent sources and good journalism. There's never a paywall on disinformation. That's free and easy to find, right?
Yes.
That's one challenge that we have as well. But yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of it can be pretty in depth. But some of the, if you're going to watch, just put a lens of this kind of outrage media while you're particularly watching TV news, let's say, but also in written journalism as well, but especially TV news, because most, especially if you're, doing a more partisan station like an MSNBC or Fox, just keep that lens in mind that they are trying to rally you up and tell you how terrible the other side is all the time, and try to watch for it, or don't watch those channels at all. But if you are going to watch it, try to keep that lens that they are trying to do that to you, and do have that. And for all media, whether it's online or reading, anytime you can kind of feel your blood flushing, your face is flushing, your blood's starting to go, that's probably a great time to ask and say, what are they leaving out of this story? Is there more to this story? And is there maybe another source I can look at about that story and find out a little bit more detail? Like as an example, I've seen a situation where, a person was really mad about there was like a trans, like story time or something that happened. And there was or there was a trans thing that was promoted somewhere, and somehow there was something inappropriate happened. Well, when you actually go find this story, it was like, well, it was one time in 2011 in Holland that this thing happened, right? But it was being portrayed in this article as though this was everywhere, like all your cities, grab your children, this is happening everywhere. And it was like this thing happened one time in Holland. Never happened once in the United States, right? But and that's just an extreme example of that kind of reporting, though. But where that's usually a good time to ask, am I really getting this full story? If they're getting me this mad, and maybe it's justified, maybe it's fully justified, and you probably should be mad and say, well, I'm mad now, what am I going to do? Right? But many times you'll find there's more of that story, and it's probably not quite as bad as you thought it was, or there's a little bit less to it. And when you really research it, it's a little more nuance to that story. I mean, I think I love your show as a similarity to my show in this, that we don't mind. We go into the nuance, right? We go into the complexity of things. We don't walk away from the complexity and nuance. And we have to get, as a general populace, we have to get more comfortable with doing that, right? We have to be more comfortable with kind of simultaneously holding two thoughts that are not quite, have a little bit of conflict, things like that, right? And so that's one thing is watch for that blood boiling and use that as an indicator to dive a little deeper. But I did mention 1440 News. I recommend them. That's a good one. You can subscribe to that. You'll get a daily update of, just some good summaries of things, and then some references to usually pretty reasonable pieces. They've done some vetting, and those sources are usually reasonable. Other Web is an interesting product where you can kind of choose the publications you want and the things like that. And you would think, well, that's going to be worth going to be in my filter bubble more. And you probably could use it that way. But if you use it in a sensible way, it doesn't work like that. You end up getting just higher quality stuff, but it spans across, kind of it's not partisan. So that's a good tool to play around with. Those are both free. The flip side is another one to look at if you want to do the whole, we talked about high lift, though, like we talk about, the flip side, the thing with things like the flip side, which I think they're trying to do good work, and I totally support them. But you're again asking the reader to do more work. So now I got one article. Now you're asking me to go read another one or two more, So that again is a lot of lift. Why can't I just go one place that gives me the whole story in one place?
Right.
But that's kind of the world we live in now. But the flip side is one that does that. It'll say kind of what the left is saying and what the right is saying on I think they pick a couple of topics each time and put that out. But I think have gone to a subscription model, so that's got a paywall now. But it's a good product.
Aside from that, too, as we mentioned, people just do not have the time to do these deep dives into the media. And so they're getting, I mean, it's surprising how many people are getting their news from Facebook.
Right. So it's been curated by algorithms and other people, right? Not all necessarily with good intentions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the same thing there. If you see it, your blood boiling a little bit, it's probably time to see if you're getting the full story. Like often if it's a meme, and then it sort of references an article or even the headline, like, journalists, of course, get upset about this because the journalist that did the story didn't write the headline, right? It was like the marketing team wrote the headline, right? And the journalists even get mad sometimes at what the headline says because it doesn't actually is not a good representation of what the article says. And people, then he gets the author of the piece gets a hate mail because of that. But yeah, so I mean, the headline is not enough. You got to read into that story. Even within that one story, it might practically contradict the headline just by reading the story.
Yeah, no, I've encountered that quite a bit. Another example, I had a journalist that actually was on the ground covering January 6th. And, he was saying, this was not an insurrection. This was maybe a riot. And he went into nuance, and he actually interviewed a lot of people on the ground. A lot of the people that are in the mainstream news, like the shaman guy. And I found that quite bizarre in the way he framed that experience. Now, he did say that there was one guy that actually said, he told a story where he gave a sandwich to somebody, one of the Trump supporters, and the guy said, I think you're a socialist and I want to kill you. And the journalist said, but I just gave you a sandwich and we're here having a conversation. And the guy was like, well, no, I still want to kill you. Not now, but when, this revolution comes about, I mean, you're on the target list.
You're on the wrong
You're
side.
on the wrong side. And it was weird because he was having a rational conversation with this guy up until that point. They were actually having a discussion kind of like what you were talking about. And there was no pushback by the journalist. The journalist was just there to get this guy's perspectives. And so I found that rather alarming and odd at the same time, because it's like, it's one thing online when you're not face to face with somebody, you're talking to someone that you don't know, you'll never meet. I understand the psychology behind that. I mean, that's one thing. But when you're face to face with somebody, it's much harder to engage in these conflicts, one would think. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and this is this. I think it represents the state of this toxic polarization that we're in now. That there are significant portions. This is maybe not a majority yet, but it's certainly large portions of people that have just bought into this cycle of how the other side is evil, that now it's become just ingrained, like it's just innate, like they just and this is part of our problem of and I don't want to be the conspiracy theorist guy either, but you talked about sort of corporate corporate owning media. C. Edwin Baker was talking about this decades ago, and even he died in 2009, so he even continued this discussion when everybody said the internet was problem solved. We have ultimate democracy now. He goes, no, it's the same thing. It's the same problem. Few corporations still run all this, and especially as social media was evolving. So, and so that and so when we talk about incentives, this is another one, right? I mean, the corporations that are feeding, as you said, both Democrats and Republicans, like they kind of don't mind if we're fighting about abortion, let's say, as a topic, because it kind of has no monetary influence to their so they love that we're fighting about abortion. This is great. Spend all your energy fighting about abortion, and you won't see us over here writing the next bill that's going to really privilege our corporation. So we have a lot of this anger is kind of misdirected. I mean, you said you're not surprised a lot of people are angry, and I get that. Clearly they are, right? I mean, we can't deny it. I mean, I think sometimes the Democrats kind of deny it and pretend like people aren't angry. People are angry, and probably, there's probably a reason. We need to go figure that out. But I think many times we have this. There are corporate interests. I could see them, with the classic, well, if those two are fighting each other, they won't. If I'm mad at my neighbor, then I'm not mad at Chevron or whoever, right? To pick a name. So they kind of like it too, right? They like us being mad at each other. That's way better for them, right? We can get all our energy, get mad at each other, be mad at our neighbor. I mean, we literally are mad at our neighbor. I mean, you mentioned in the intro.
Yeah.
And somehow our neighbor is the problem that's happening in Washington. Neither one of us are anywhere near Washington, having any influence on Washington, hardly at all. And yet we sort of have that, and that's another problem with the consolidation of news media too, that we're so focused on these national issues, right? Because we don't have local journalism like we used to. And you mentioned, a lot of bad words in your opening too. You said things like, more government spending, more public efforts, and this is something else that C. Edwin Baker talked about is like the First Amendment has, this protection side of it where, you must protect political speech, but it also has, in his interpretation of it as a scholar, it also has a proactive aspect to it, that quality information needs to go out too. That's the other half of the First Amendment that we aren't doing a very good job at. I think we're about 1/5 or maybe less of what we spend on things like public radio and public media compared to other free countries, other sort of second world, first world, I don't even know if we use that language anymore, but other kind of first world countries, we're like a fifth of what they spend, despite how rich we are. So, we clearly, and we keep talking about defunding it. Like, we're going to defund the tiny amount that we give to NPR. Like,
Yeah.
And as you noted, that's the only way some of this information might get out, right? I mean, not only, and I don't just mean giving NPR more money. There are a lot of other things we could be doing, and I think there's people a lot smarter than me, but things like, encouraging local journalism and having some kind of a method of getting more local journalism out there, because the economic incentive of capitalism isn't working. Like, there's no reason to do it. It's it's a big problem. Like, I don't think there's any magic silver bullet for fixing any of this, but I do believe there are enough smart people that we could start doing it. But a big problem is what we're talking about now, is that we still think we still don't think it's a problem. Like, like you mentioned some of the studies, I think it's Pew, but it was one of the larger studies, when they ranked, like, what's the biggest problem with the country, a large percentage of the population says the biggest problem is the other side. Like, it's not taxes, it's not immigration, it's not pollution, it's the other side. Like, just this amorphous thing that's the other side, right? And both people from both sides, or all sides, say that, right? The biggest problem in the country is sort of them, right? And that's kind of that's like where we're at now. Like, we're going to focus on that so much that solving these other problems, and everything, because of the trust, you talked about a trust issue, because of the trust issue, it's so hard to get people on the same page. I think there's I'm sure you suffer some of this too, that it seems so obvious that there's so many times when people that might consider themselves blue or red, like, should be together working on this problem. Like, it makes sense. Like, it's in both their interests, right? But it's almost become like it's not acceptable. Like, I can't get my arms wrapped around this notion that there could be something that's in both of our interests, right? That's what we really have to get out. That messaging is what's not getting out there enough, that there probably are a lot more things, or we know there are a lot more things that we could be working together on. But we have so many of these disincentives that then drive that wedge back in again, right? Because, like I said, you were saying the media has it. I think some of this corporate backing has it too. Like, they like us fighting like this.
Absolutely. I've had Republicans on this show, or people that have been leaning to the right, and my leftist friends will get outraged over that. Why are you platforming that person? Why are you having this person on the show? You're betraying the cause. You're giving voice to the enemy. And what's kind of ironic is that I've actually found that you can have more productive conversations with people who are on the right, if you're willing to listen to them, than you can with people on the left sometimes. Because it really has become this ideological imbalance that we have. And it's so frustrating, because it's just like, there are issues that are in our best interest, as you've said, to work together on. And you can find common agreement if you talk to people. But we have to get over this us versus them mentality. And that's where I see the biggest challenge today, is how do we overcome something that's been so ingrained in us for, as you said, for over 60 years. And unfortunately, I don't have any answer to that other than just listening and talking to people. But of course, how do you do that if you consider them the enemy and you're not even willing to converse with them?
Yeah, right. I think that if you look at that 60 years, right, I mean, that really is 60 years of playing on psychology that goes back, tens of thousands of years, right? So some of this is just our tribal nature in general. And it's almost like America was a fluke, in that everything, the way that a republic, the way our government was set up as a democratic republic, and that it requires, cooperation. And what it really requires fundamentally is it requires both sides to believe the other side sort of sticking to the rules, and can make, can think rationally and come to rational conclusions. If that breaks, like, you think, well, the other side's not following the rules, that can justify me not. And so what we're really talking about is a fundamental, psychology of humans that we've got to overcome. And it is a effort, right? This doesn't come naturally. This is like trained behavior. It's like the difference between, that this was it the first speed, the slow speed, and the high speed brain part, right? It's like you fast and slow brain, I guess I think is there's a book about that. And you know, and it's that idea that we have all these circuitry that's wired to do things a certain way, and you have to kind of overcome that with the slow brain, which requires you to actually activate it, and also requires you to train it. So it's kind of the difference between learning about critical thinking and just kind of thinking you're doing critical thinking, right? I mean, critical thinking is a skill. It's not natural. Like, it's not the way humans normally work. So it requires you to build those skills and understand how to do it, and then practice it. Like, you can't just read about it. You got to go do it. And you got to have like vetting of it and everything else to see that you are doing it, right? So there's a bunch of uphill climbs there, right? For us to get out of this problem, because it's so innate to be in it, that yeah, you definitely raise a big problem. But and so again, that kind of takes me back to a lot of people that are working on it, and no one has a great solution to this. Like you said, I do try to be upbeat. I always talk to scientists and researchers and authors about, I always try to have them give some kind of, do they have some upbeat story to tell us, or just how do we get out of this, or what do they think, you know? And sometimes I sort of get the, well, I don't have an answer, right? I sort of get the, I know a lot about what's broken, but I don't know how to fix it. But if you look at a lot of the things that people are working on, you know, you have a lot of organizations trying to do like civil dialogue, and you know, some of the challenge there is it can have effect, but how do you scale it? So you got, you know, challenge with scaling. So you know, but a lot of it's going to require, I think, many efforts, and a lot of it, I think, is going to be a movement. It's going to have to probably start from the bottom up, and it's going to have to go kind of be a spark that ignites, you know, a larger flame. And you know, and then that can start to pull things from the down, because they don't, you know, if you look at Trump, like we were talking about Trump before. I mean, he did not really, he wasn't really top down. He didn't give people their agenda. He figured out what they wanted to hear, and he fit into it. It was a bottom-up movement that brought Trump up. It wasn't the elites in the Republican Party that thought Trump was the guy. I mean, if you remember 2015,
right,
he was not the guy, right? But so it wasn't the elites that brought Trump here. It was a grassroots, if you will, or some kind of a bottom-up movement. So, you know, the bottom-up can influence the elites, right? At some point, if we start to say this is not how we want to be, if we start to do this, that can have. So that's where I'm kind of most hopeful, but nobody really has a clear answer of how to get out of it. I think we can work on ourselves individually. That's where we can, you know, we have some agency in that, so we can be, you know, more aware, more mindful about this kind of media. We can try to be more mindful about our own emotions, and we can also just learn more, like study civics a little better, understand how our government works. And we wouldn't ask politicians to make promises they can't keep if you knew they didn't really have the power to do it, right? You'd sort of focus on something else that they could do for you. So just understanding some of those things and educating yourself about that are things you can do for yourself that will help you calm down a little bit. That might make you still mad a little bit, because you go like, now I understand the physics. Now there's other people have it all wrong, you know, but yeah, they could be doing better. But I think, you know, and I think there's another thing we talked about, like even in the climate episode you listened to, you know, doing something small. Maybe that's all we can do, right? Maybe all we can do is raise our kids well, right? And maybe that's what we can do. So don't consider that nothing. Like, you know, that's a thing. Like, you know, give them some good roots, some good grounding, and, you know, and do a handoff. You know, if that's what you can do, that's what you can do. So, I mean, sometimes we can feel pretty helpless in all this, but there are things you can do. I mean, you can join an organization like Braver Angels or Crossing Party Lines. You can, obviously you can participate in your own local elections. You can, you know, get involved other ways. So there are a lot of organizations. I mean, I think Peter Coleman has identified, I don't know, 8,000 some odd organizations out there working in some of these kind of spaces. And you can be an advocate. Like my show I'm not doing advocacy in terms of like I'm preaching for a partisan position. We're a nonpartisan show, but there are advocacy groups, and I had an advocate on my show. I mean, you were talking about how sometimes you get some heat for bringing somebody on. So I had someone who's like a, you know, dyed-in-the-wool, outspoken progressive, and they've actually got an organization where they're trying to persuade Trump voters, you know, to see the light. But the way they're doing it is what made it work for my show. They're using, you know, this kind of listening psychology. They're using understanding first, and it's kind of a understand. And you know, you talked about like we can't talk to our adversaries. one thing I thought that she said that was really great, Karen Tamaris is her name. And one thing I thought that she said was really great. It's like, you can't influence people that you aren't in connection with, right? You don't have a connection with, right? So, I mean, you have to maintain that connection. And what I like about their approach is they would like to convert people, but that's not, I mean, like if that doesn't happen,
Right.
they've still, they've still learned something in this dialogue they've had with this Trump supporter that they didn't have before. And maybe they can continue that dialogue or whatever, but it's not like I'm going to change you on my first conversation or else kind of thing.
I want to ask you, how does identity politics fuel political outrage? And is it even possible, or can identity-based movements even survive without stoking polarization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it's part of our problem is we've made our political identity, too salient in our overall lives. Like I think, we don't, have as much church community and other kinds of, we're not getting out as much in our local, you probably know about the Bowling Alone, the Putnam book, and how we don't really have, aren't on bowling leagues anymore and this kind of stuff. We don't have as much local community to attach to and other things to attach to. So somehow our political identity has started to just really shape us and other people. Like we make these, I had an expert on talking about how we make these really quick judgments about people, how they look, their haircut, what shoes they wear, all this kind of stuff. And we quickly kind of jump them into a political identity bucket. So that's what some people talk about, is somehow kind of reducing this political identity is probably somehow got to be part of this equation of making things better, that we can maybe find some better identities. And I don't have the exact answer to what that is, but something healthier than putting all our eggs in our political identity basket, which is what a lot of us have done now.
Yes.
And it does make for a super high temperature.
Do you think, I don't want to make predictions, but it looks like Trump is likely to win the presidency again. Do you think that we as a nation can survive that?
I mean, I'll agree that I don't like to make predictions. And I'll also agree that it's going to be close. It's anybody's call at this point. And I was saying that, I said that 6 months ago. I did a whole episode about this. And, people were saying, well, you're crazy. There's no way it's going to be close. It's like, oh, it's going to be close. Don't. That's one prediction I made. And I think I'll be right on that one. And who knows, I might not be, like, no. But yeah, so, I've been kind of in this unexpected role of kind of talking people off the ledge about this to some degree for quite a while now, or for the last year or so. And sometimes I have to admit, I don't know if I believe it all, right? But I have some right-leaning political scientists that I kind of tap into and try to talk to them about, what about these safeguards? What about these backstops? How might some of this play out? I did do an episode talking about Agenda 47, which is more or less some of Project 2025 stuff, but it's on Trump's website, so he can't really walk away from it. So we just picked a few of those, and Project 2025 is like, I don't know, 800 pages thing is giant. So, that's way too much to cover, but I picked like three of the biggies, the firing civil servants and a couple of the others, right? And it took an hour just to cover those three. And so that episode's online for people to check out. And what that episode is trying to do is sort of say, maybe let's tone it back a little bit. Let's see, what might this really play out like? Could some of these backstops protect us? And what are the, sort of worst case scenarios? And obviously the DOJ stuff is some of the scariest, right? Because he would, as a president, you have a lot of power over the DOJ. And with this immunity clause now and with pardon power, it's potentially pretty scary. I mean, he could make, even if people didn't go to jail, he could make a lot of people's lives miserable if he wanted to, right? Just fighting all those lawsuits, and even if you win or lost on appeals and all this kind of stuff, it could pretty much ruin your life with lawsuits if, with criminal charges if you wanted to, I think, right? There's, even if you didn't lose, even if we trust our jury system, which is kind of what a lot of these political scientists would say, trust our jury system, it's going to save us, or, that will be a big factor in all this. Even if that's true, you just spent 5 years fighting in court, and, where'd you get the money to do that? So you could still, like I say, have a lot of impact from that. Yeah, obviously has a lot of influence over foreign things, right? That's part of the president's, that's within his power. So there's lots of stuff he could do that could be trouble. He sort of talks about wanting to, end our participation in NATO and other things. I think these could have really bad, catastrophic economic effects, as well as obviously the political effects. But he's another one of these guys that he said a lot of things the first time and didn't do all of them either. Right. So, but I do, and so then you do wonder, like, how much of his rhetoric has gotten hotter, right?
Yeah,
He's
much
saying
hotter.
even crazier things. And so how much of it is he going to try to do, and how much of it can be stopped? I mean, what are our backstops, right? Our backstops are our court system, Congress to a degree, right? Because Congress has some, there's some minority management in Congress. If Congress, went all his way, there still could be some pushback from the minority, even if Democrats were the minority. So there's some there. Plus, you have the midterm elections are kind of a pushback. People could reverse the House if they thought it was that bad. So you might see that pushback in a midterm election. Obviously, there's states, and what states, whatever, the amount states can do with referendums and things like that. Now, how much could the federal side? I mean, we have to remember that presidents don't make law. So, you got the areas where he can have influence. The DOJ is a big one. Some of the civil service potentially, but some of that's going to be a challenge for him, according to a lot of the legal scholars I've spoken with. There'll be a lot of lawsuits, that's for darn sure. There's going to be, and a lot of organizations, the ACLU and others, have kind of got these lawsuits like ready to file, like they've already written them, or at least, written drafts of them. So there's going to be a lot of lawsuits, trying to push back. And so can we survive it? I don't know, for sure. Like I say, the American focused political scientists say, yes, our institutions will keep us afloat. The international guys say, yeah, maybe not. They might not hold. So it's scary because, our institute, I think we've had it so good for so long. I think it's almost like a privilege to complain about how bad things are. Right. And that kind of worries me, that we don't realize how good we have it. And maybe it's going to take some kind of a bottoming out. I mean, that's what some of the scientists, some of the researchers in this space say. It's going to be kind of like an addiction. We're going to have to hit some kind of rock bottom before we realize this toxic polarization is not working for any of us. And I don't know what that rock bottom looks like. That's what I'm kind of nervous about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll admit, I'm scared to death of what's going to happen. Which leads me to my next question, which is, how does political outrage affect our overall mental health? And what are some of the warning signs that we might be getting caught up in it?
Yeah, well, this is one of the reasons why I really, it's always good to start with ourselves, because that's where we have the agency to actually do something, right? We can't fix the other side, which is what everybody wants, the magic pill to fix the other side. That'll solve all my problems if you can fix the other side, right? Well, that's not going to happen. And certainly there's not going to be any magic pill to do that. But what you can do is you can work on your side. So yeah, so it's very clear. There's a lot of studies showing the kinds of mental health challenges. Well, mostly it comes from stress, right? I mean, stress is the easiest one you can connect all these mental health issues to. So, this is where you have to try things that work for you, right? So there's positive psychology kind of techniques. I don't like to get in. Sometimes the psychobabble turns people off, but some of it's just simple stuff, right? Some of it's just doing an inventory of what did you do this week, or what did I do today, or whatever, and looking at the things that cause you to get more stressed out, and looked at things that cause you to be happy, or you felt like they were helping you achieve your goals, and focus more on the things in the second category, right? So focus on those things that tend to and spend less time doing those things that are making you angry. I think, as I mentioned before, if you are going to go into news media, try to turn on that lens, a little bit more of an observer lens, kind of just remember that they're trying to manipulate you, and having that, a lot of the researchers talk about it as kind of an inoculation. Like I'm preparing myself to go in knowing they're going to start feeding me this stuff, and that inoculates me a little bit. Now, all of that falls apart the first time you get angry, right? And then your front brain shuts off, and then your dinosaur brain kicks in. But that's something you can do. I think getting good sleep, like some of these, like, you seem like this all sounds cliche, right? But this stuff actually makes a difference. And there's neuroscience for it. It's not just psychobabble, right? So getting good sleep. So, thinking about a sleep routine, turning off devices, while you sleep, or at least putting them in, like a sleep mode. Getting a dark room, making it cool, having a nice set routine as you go to bed. It's kind of a wind down where you start unwinding from media and other things in your day. I mean, not all of us have the privilege. I get it, to do all this, but these are all things that you can do to help. And then determining like your bandwidth for things, right? Like we all are feeling helpless a little bit. We want to do more, but be realistic with yourself and give yourself a break. Like I said before, if raising your kids is what you could do, then just do that and focus on that. That's a great thing to do. So be a little bit, just be easy on yourself about how much you can do, and try to, identify something. Okay, I can contribute 2 hours a week to something, right? And say, that's something. That's 2 hours a week I wasn't doing before, or whatever, right? So, maybe you can find a cause that's something along, something you feel like it's a positive thing, and get involved in that kind of stuff. So that's another place. Just be easy on yourself about it, because you can't fix it all, and you're going to have to, what's the old, the old one about the, I have to recognize the things I can't change and know the difference, right? So recognize the things you can't change, and you're just going to have to sort of like do what you can where you can. I think there's no way to magically tell you not to be afraid about either candidate. Like if you're afraid Kamala Harris is going to win, I can't tell you not to be afraid about that. Like
Right.
you might be totally afraid about that, but try to be realistic about it. Try to find sources that will present a little bit broader picture and help you with some of those realities, because you don't want to just go in your echo chamber where all they're going to do is rile you up more about how this candidate's going to destroy the world next week. That's not a that's not a good place to be, and it only makes things worse. So try to find enough alternative sources that will, maybe a little more balance, a little more temper there. But I get it, how people believe some of these things could happen. I mean, I don't see Kamala Harris, being in that camp, but some people do, and they get it. I mean, they're afraid of it, and so they're just as afraid as a lot of people that are afraid of Trump. I mean, I think Trump has kind of shown, what he will do, so it seems a little different. But I get it; people fall into where they are. But yeah, so try not to fall in that bubble where you're only getting the worst possible framing all the time of the people. That just ramps it up. But do some of those things that just help your own mental health, right? So inoculation's a big one. Limiting your time too, right? So decide when, don't doom scroll before you go to bed. Like that's one of the worst things you could do. Find something else to occupy you during that sleep, as you're heading into that wind down mode, because you don't want to be going to bed afraid. That will really ruin your sleep. So all of those things are kind of small, but they're all something. I mean, and if you sort of if you wanted to look up kind of the positive psychology techniques, there's hundreds of things you can try, and some of them are going to work for some people and not work for others, but somewhere in there are probably a few that you might get a little value out of.
How is the evolution of media consumption, as far as habits go, such as the 24-hour news cycle, how has that contributed to the rise of political outrage?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a couple ways. One is, of course, we talked before a little bit about the nationalization of issues, right? So since we have these 24-hour news cycles, and they're trying to speak to this broad audience, so they're just focusing on national issues all the time. So we get obsessed with these national issues when often this is something going on in Washington that's not going to affect us that much. And there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in our state or in our community that are probably affecting us more. So that's one way. And then we get more riled up about that. But yeah, so they have to fill that spot, and they have to keep that engagement up, and they're fighting with all kinds of other ways we can spend our time. So they're obviously going to just keep ramping that up. And they keep, this business model, to me, it's surprising that and again, it works for them, I guess, but it seems like it doesn't work that well. But if you've noticed, like if you go into the TV media, they sort of have picked their 5 stories for the day, and they're just going to repeat those 5 stories throughout the entire day, which I guess, that's cheaper. They only have to do 5 stories. But, obviously we all know there's more things that happen than 5 things, right? And we're not getting that. We're just being fed those 5 that they felt are the ones that are going to be the most engaging, I guess. So that's another problem too. Is you get so much reinforcement of the same, another slight variation on this of the same version you just saw. So you can get overwhelmed that way. But in terms of the changes in media consumption in general, I mean, I think we're still kind of figuring it out in terms of social media. We're still figuring it out, as new social media platforms come about and people, you know, one of the big things you see with people saying, well, I don't consume news. I get my information, from TikTok or Instagram or something.
Right.
Right. And they think they're not consuming news, but they sort of are. And it's worse that they're not actively being a participant in it. Right. They're just getting whatever the algorithms have decided to give them. And that's kind of the worst kind of news consumption. Right. But that's the most common there is now. Right. So this concerns me a lot. And I don't know, how do you fix that? Right. You have to change people's attention span. How are you going to do that? Right. So this is an area where I don't know one I've talked to has really a great answer for this. I mean, there are things people, I shouldn't say that. Researchers know there's things that you could do to improve that. But it might hurt the bottom line of the Instagram, Facebook, and these companies. So they're probably not, unless,
Yeah.
and again, I don't know if I would support an idea of having the government require them to do that, but that's like, maybe that's the only way they could do it, or figure out some other incentive to do it. But they do know, researchers know the kind of things that you could do, like inoculation and other things you can do in those news feeds to improve that. But it hurts the engagement, right? Because it doesn't give them what they want. So it comes back to those incentives, and that, because engagement and attention are what they're trying to do. It's not like, I don't think any of these social media companies set out to like destroy our brains, but it's like water flows downhill, and that's just where this system has ended up. It's like it's a reach for the bottom, as it's worse and worse content, more and more infuriating content, is what gets what gets your attention, and also just dominates the platform. Plus, the people creating that content tend to overwhelm the platform. So anybody with a more nuanced story to tell, is hard to find. Although I will say, you're starting to see like interest in that. Like there's a niche, or there's people out there looking for that kind of content. So you can stand out in a way when you have a show like ours, where we're willing to dive into some of that nuance, and not just willing to say, here's a black and white answer. Right? It's clearly this, right? I know some people, even on my show, I get complaints about that. Like, why don't you just tell me how it's going to be? Well, the world's more complicated than that. Almost nothing is that simple, right?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about one solution, or one potential solution, and that is, how can media literacy combat the spread of outrage? And are there specific media literacy tools that you can recommend that you've found successful?
Yeah, well, media literacy and just like science literacy, and critical thinking are like, that's probably our savior. But how you get from here to there, it is a challenge, because it's a workload. And you even get a little bit, to a degree, people are going to be going, all right, that sounds good, but that sounds like a lot of work. Like, why do I even want to do that? Right. So there can be a lot of just innate pushback to that. But yeah, so do I have great resources for that? Well, I mean, like I said before, one of the challenges is a lot of the resources that are out there. I mean, I'm affiliated with the Connors Institute, and that's like a big piece of their mission is media literacy. They're affiliated with the Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania, and that's a big piece of what they do. And they have a media guide that they put out that does look at sources, and sort of says sources and they give you the rubrics. They explain how they arrived at that, and they sort of give you sources that are worthy of your time, and ones that probably aren't. But that's, like I said before, that's still not quite enough, because even a good publication can put out bad content, right? So it's a start. It's something. And of course, they have media guides and things like that as well on there. But again, it's a pretty big ask, right? It's a pretty big lift to go study that stuff. So that's one example. You have stuff like Ad Fontes Media. Like I mentioned, the Flip Side, that's another one that kind of shows that presents summaries of what the left and right has said, and then you could drill down if you care to go further. But their editors have kind of picked out a summary, where you don't have to read the whole article if you don't have the time. You get a better representation of it than just the headline, if you just saw the headline. And they've scoured a lot of content to kind of come up with 5 or 6 things from the left and 5 or 6 things from the right, to give you a reasonable sense of what is being said out there about that topic. But yeah, this is a challenging problem, And I do appreciate, I've had a couple of folks on that are really working on this to add this to curriculum, both at the high school and at the college level.
It's very important.
Yeah, we've got to increase it, and it's one of those things that I think doesn't have enough appreciation. Like, we should really appreciate this more, and because it's so critical to have just the basics. Just a small improvement over, sort of the mean is a huge jump. Like, you may not be a media expert, but just a small improvement will change your life.
We talked about critical thinking, and I'm wondering if you can recommend some ways that individuals can develop critical thinking skills, sort of to see through the outrage trap that is set by the media outlets.
Yeah. Well, like I said, the first step is a lot of times just asking yourself if you're getting a full picture. Are there other sources that maybe have a different version of this? Am I really getting a full picture? That's one of the best questions to keep asking. But when you get in the topic of critical thinking, right, it's actually because it's really a challenging space, because there is no one kind of definitive, this is the best site ever on critical thinking. And also, you get down a lot of rabbit holes where it's like, wow, I'm halfway into this, and they've not really described critical thinking once yet, right? Like, it's taking me down all these other kind of things that don't have anything to do with it. I think if you look at some of the work, like I want to say David Helfand is one that has some content around this. I think I want to say on YouTube. He's an astrophysicist out of Columbia, and he's got some content, I believe, online that kind of tries to walk through what critical thinking is. And one thing that he did at his university, it took a long time to do, is he put together, he now has a course that every student has to take as they come in, whether they're science or not. So they have to take this basic science literacy / critical thinking type course that has math. Like, you have to actually be able to do some math. And so, he gets a lot of pushback on that, but it's like, he tells everyone, like, don't say you can't do math. You can do math. Like, you're a smart person, you can do math. So, that's an example of how he's really pushed for this kind of thing. I unfortunately, like I say, I don't really have one go-to resource. About critical thinking, because it is a controversial topic. It itself has become somewhat polarized as what critical thinking even means, right? But a key piece of it, of course, is evidence. Like, this is what's often missing in some of these people that say, go do your own research. Like, one thing they're lacking is, what's the evidence for this theory that you have, or this idea you want to believe, right? So figuring out what is evidence and whether you have it or not. And also, another big thing that I think is an important aspect here is, what do they call it? Like, what's the opposite of confirmation bias? It's like, look for the worst, try to be your devil's advocate, right? Try very hard to counter your argument. So you can try to be the opposite of your case. So if you were on the other side on a debate team and had to make the opposite case, go try to do that and see if you can disprove what you can do on the disproving what you think about it side. And that can be really hard, because especially if we've become a little bit attached to what we thought was happening. But those are some of the really beginning skills that can really be helpful, is to be aware of that they're trying to manipulate you a lot of times, be aware you may not be seeing the full picture, and then try to counter the side that you kind of feeling happy about, or like, I like this story. Go see if there's some contrary evidence to that. And then do you have evidence for the thing you believe, right? Is there actually evidence for it? And I think that's what's missing in a lot of the conspiracy theory stuff that you see when people say they're doing critical thinking, but you don't actually have any evidence. You have all this weird sort of pattern matching stuff that you've done, but there's no actual concrete evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you describe the concept of group polarization and how that intensifies political outrage, both in the physical space and online space?
Well, are we sort of talking about like group theory?
Yeah.
Well, right. So, I mean, you probably are aware of some of this, but there's a lot of research about this, and you might know the experiment where, like, they took the kids and they were isolated into groups, and what they did is they they just arbitrarily assigned them a group, and I forget how they labeled them, but like you're the Wildcats and you're the Badgers or whatever, right? And then they sort of separated them on this island where they were camping or whatever, or into these camp groups, and over time they came to hate the other side because they grouped up, and then they would and they were ready, and they had to actually end the experiment because these kids started to like throw rocks at each other and stuff like that, and
Oh,
there was
wow.
nothing about this identity other than that they were told they were a Badger or a Wildcat or whatever, right? There was nothing in common among these kids. They just got arbitrarily assigned to a group, and so they went into this group pattern. So it shows how that's just, there's a lot of experiments like that. And there's simpler ones too, where people did things like, they would do the same kind of thing. You'd arbitrarily get assigned to a group, and then you'd have to decide how to allocate your money. And you'd always give more money to people on your side, right? So these are just very innate things to us when really there's nothing binding that group, right? You just got arbitrarily dropped into it. So it's very clear that there's and a lot of the scientists believe this is like an evolution, part of our evolutionary biology. It's like part of our niche. It's like why we survived, or why we were able to sort of dominate, is that we're very good at grouping up and coordinating in groups, and we were able to coordinate in larger groups than other homo species, and that's became sort of part of our survival, and that's very deep. And there's a saying in social psychology that the fear of social death is greater than the fear of physical death. And that's what you were talking about a little bit in the intro as well, that if I say the wrong thing in my peer group, I'm going to be ostracized, right?
Yeah.
And our brain sees that as basically a death sentence, right? Because you're going to be thrown out into the wild and you'll be on your own. And humans, we sacrifice muscles for brain, right? And so we aren't good on our own out there against big wild animals, right? But we can do amazing things in groups.
In groups.
So
Yeah.
it's in our psychology to join up into these groups. And I guess I'm still on. So anyway, so yeah, so anyway, so that's a big piece of that, is that it's so deep in our psychology that is how this plays into this tribalism that we experience.
I'm back. Sorry.
No problem. That plays into this tribalism that we experience now. There's an interesting book on this that I like, by the Hiram brothers, and it's a book called "The Myth of Left and Right," that talks about how our ideology is kind of a made up thing. Like we these positions on people that are left or right have changed over time, and we just change with them, and we just invent a new narrative to say why we now believe this new thing that we believe, and we still call it that it has some root in ideology. And his point, or their point in that book, is that really it's pretty much just all tribalism, and we make up these facts, that there's an idea or philosophy behind it after the fact. And I see that a lot. I mean, we've seen this over time. It's happened with a lot of issues. I mean, Democrats used to be against immigration, right? Because it was going to take it was impacting the worker, this kind of thing. And and the Republicans were for immigration, right? And then now they kind of switched, but they both say it's for ideological reasons, right? So I mean, I think Bernie Sanders was actually a pretty strong against immigration pretty strongly at one time. So you see these positions change, and we just change with it because it's really more about the tribe, and we've identified with that tribe, and it has less about these philosophical and ideology things. So it's a deep part of our psychology that plays into this. That again, it comes back to that identity piece. That if we can make these political identities a little bit less salient in our lives, I think we'd be better off.
And what practical steps can individuals take to manage their own outrage when engaging with politics and media? We talked about some of them, but I mean, are there specific traits people can use to sort of manage their outrage?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have talked about a lot of them, a lot of the basic ones that are the easiest to sort of do and talk about quickly. That kind of inoculation can play into it. That's a big factor. And timing, and how much, and maybe even time blocking. Like maybe I'm only going to doom scroll for 5 minutes. Some other techniques you can just try and see if it works for you are things like, I'm going to spend more time this week drilling down and going deeper rather than going wide. So maybe there's a topic that catches my interest, and I'm going to go a little deep. I'll spend my energy going deep, and I'll just kind of ignore some of the periphery stuff that goes around me, and I'll go a little deeper into that one topic. That can sometimes be an interesting way to feel like you're participating and you're getting involved, but not getting overwhelmed. Because I mean, the one reason I talk about outrage overload is like outrage itself. It's a useful emotion, right? I mean, researchers think it exists because this was how you would spur action, right? So we would get outraged about people violating norms and things like that, and then we do something to enforce those norms. And so outrage itself is not necessarily always bad. There's probably some things we should absolutely be outraged about. But this outrage overload, this kind of turn it up to 11 and we're outraged all the time, is kind of, it destroys the ability for it to serve its purpose. Like if I'm just outraged all the time, I can't do anything. I can't act. I'm helpless. I'm paralyzed. So that's a piece of it, is trying to be a little bit more selective, or, focused on should I be this mad about this thing, is a great question to ask a lot. Like, should I be this mad about this thing? Is this, and some of these are the hard questions that we don't like to ask. Like, who am I? Who do I want to be? What are my values? What do I really stand for? What's important to me? Like, you kind of got to know that stuff, right? Or you probably will be outraged all the time because you don't even know who you are and what you stand for. So spend some energy on that and just revisit it once in a while. Say, who am I again? And what am I trying? What do I want to be? And who do I want to be? Revisit that once in a while and kind of remind yourself. And then that can help you kind of decide, what things do I let slide this week, or at least not put all my energy there. And maybe I will be a little outraged about this one. Okay, so now what can I do about it? And try to see if there are actions you can take. Is there a movement? Is there, something I can do? Is there a letter I could write? But I don't recommend making your action be like, just send a tweet, right? That doesn't really achieve much. A letter to a politician is a little bit more potentially, that might actually have some effect. They get fewer letters than people think, by the way, and they do sometimes read them and sometimes pay attention. But the thing about a tweet is that, it blows off steam for a moment, but usually it doesn't make you feel better the next day. Right. And it doesn't really do anything. Like, people have seen you say that same tweet 1,000 times. It's not changing anybody's mind. And you're probably also talking to an echo chamber anyway. Like, you're not convincing anybody on the other side, probably. So it's just kind of cheerleading, which maybe you want some cheerleading once in a while. That's fine. But just be aware that that's all you're doing, is a little bit of cheerleading. You're not going to, if you just scream, the minimum wage should be $25 every day on Twitter, like, it's not going to really do anything. Right.
Well, let me ask you, are there moments in political history where outrage was justified and actually led to positive change?
Well, I think there are. I mean, I think clearly some of these revolutions probably were, ultimately, and some of these may be manufactured just like everything else, but they probably had an underlying, set of circumstances, the Boston Tea Party or whatever, right? The taxes related to that, and things like that can be things that spur you into action. Maybe the French Revolution. I don't know if that's a great example, considering how that all turned out, but it's obviously the outrage has been used as a way to get people to inspire people to action many times in the past. And I think, the challenge is, like we say, avoiding the outrage overload and being a little more selective of what to be outraged about and who to be outraged at, and who are the real culprits here, and trying to be, reasonable about getting those sources and finding, a clearer picture of beyond the headline, I guess is what I want to say, right? Going beyond that headline. Because if the headline's enough to get you to throw something across the room, then yeah, you're
Yeah, I've been there myself, to be honest with you.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Have you come across any compelling stories from your podcast listeners who have successfully disengaged from outrage culture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the main things that I do appreciate, and because it's probably one of the, like, my sort of micro goals, where it's like, if I could change one person a little bit or improve their situation a little bit, that would be a great achievement, right? So, I love getting that kind of feedback, and I have. I mean, I know I've got, things like people have said, "Hey, you prevented me from having a stroke," which is probably an exaggeration, but I mean, they feel like, some of these tools have been helpful. and some of the just kind of knowing a little bit more about what's going on. It kind of depends on people as to how they process the stuff and what ways they can, apply it for themselves. But that's what I try to do, is kind of, if we can learn a little bit more about it, it might make more sense, and you might get it a little bit more, and then you might be more able to kind of see what's going on, and then maybe think about like what's going on with me and that kind of stuff. But then we also talk about actual practical things we can do as individuals. So yeah, I get that kind of feedback. I've had, folks say that, they've not, I wouldn't say reconciled, maybe reconciled is the right word, but I'd say reconnected, and not necessarily change each other's mind. Like they're not on the same page, but they reconnected with people on different places on the spectrum that they were previously disconnected from, and feel like they can, kind of accept that discomfort better than before. And some of that's also probably because they also referred to some of the stuff we've had on the show, and they've gone out and looked at some of the tools that some of the guests have talked about on the show. But so that's good feedback too. That I love seeing that people have been able to reconnect, with people, and also just change their mind a little bit about how evil the other side is. And again, I'm not really telling anybody to stop taking your position, to stop advocating for your side or whatever, but not in such a way that's damaging to yourself.
Destructive, right?
Yeah, destructive to you, or even overall democracy.
Yeah. What role does anonymity on the internet play in the escalation of political outrage, and how does it embolden some of our most extreme behavior, do you think?
From what the experts I've talked about that with, because that's the kind of thing we just sort of assume that, that I can be more anonymous, so I'm going to be, I'm going to be worse behavior. And there's truth to that for sure. But most of the experts say that's not the biggest problem. Like that's not the worst thing to worry about. Because, once you've become this, and that's a thing that sort of trolls do, right? In other words, people that just like to rile people up, but people that actually have sort of become to where this identity is really important to them, to where they really bought into this thing that I'm morally right, the other side's evil and morally bad. They actually want to be out there saying this stuff with their real name to a degree, right? Because they want the credit for it, right? They want the social points for, and it may not be a real name, it may still be kind of a pseudonym or an online name, but they don't want to be like completely anonymous. Like they'll say this stuff in public too, right? At least in some forums. So, they don't see the anonymity as the fundamental thing. I mean, obviously you've got a challenge, especially if you're, that what people aren't going to be a real name and a real person if they're out there doing some of the really bad disinformation, or if they're out there trying to, incite violence and things like that, then they're much more likely to do that. But in terms of just in general toxic polarization, it seems to be less of a factor, because people actually sort of want to have their identity associated with it, because they really believe this stuff. Like they've really fallen into that I'm better than them, and I want to tell the world how all the ways that I'm better than them.
On a similar note, how does the dopamine effect, as far as likes and retweets and retweets or whatever the hell they're called now,
right?
How does that sort of, feed into this outrage culture that we have?
Yeah, for sure. It's got some really bad psychology, right? And I'm forgetting the technical name for some of it, but there's this idea of this delayed and random award. It's got a better technical term that's kind of the effect of what we're talking about, and it's kind of like a slot machine, right? If you won every time on the slot machine, it kind of wouldn't be that fun, right? So there's some of that same psychology going on with likes and shares and stuff that you get, that when you sign on, how many likes am I going to see? And you might notice that typically there's kind of a little delay before when they pop that number up, right? Because you're sitting there with this anticipation to see, like, is it 4? Is it 400? Is it, so there's some of that same exact kind of behavior, like a slot machine, where I do things and I get different reaction. I don't always get a reward, but I sometimes do, and that keeps me playing, right? So So yeah, that dopamine, that all of these, various neurotransmitters are a big factor in this, right? And it has this short-term boost, but obviously it's typically, I mean, almost all cases, the long-term effect is not good, not because the dopamine, but because the underlying thing we're doing doesn't actually align with our values and that kind of thing. So we don't actually feel good about it, and also doesn't typically achieve anything bigger than a like here and there. So we don't feel good in the long run from doing it, but we sort of think we do. And in the short run, it feels good. We do get a benefit out of it. Like we get that little shot of juice. And so that's what makes it really addictive, right? It's that random, sometimes you win, but you don't always win. So you keep doing it thinking this time is going to be the time. And it keeps you in the game to have that. And whether that's intentional or whether it's sort of just an accident of them trying a lot of experiments and realizing which ones kept you more engaged, and this is where they arrived. But that's the end result. It's very much like an addictive gambling game. It's very similar to that because we're waiting for that reward. We don't always get it, but we get it sometimes, and then it feels even better because we must have done something really cool because we got the reward.
So how do we strike a balance between expressing our legitimate grievances and contributing to a toxic political environment?
Yeah, I like this question a lot because it's one of the hardest questions everybody grapples with. And, I look at it, Zachary Elwood, talks about this a lot on his Substack, and he also writes for this group called Starts With Us, which is an organization kind of in this bridge building space. And, he talks about this idea of you can simultaneously sort of be outraged and believe the other side maybe is even contributing to the problem more, but see that listening to them and looking for the rational and reasonable things that they're doing is worth not raising the temperature higher. It's worth it to simultaneously hold those two views. Like I don't have to let them change my mind. I don't have to stop believing what I'm believing if I listen to them, right? It doesn't mean I've changed. It doesn't mean I agree with them or that, and they might change my mind, who knows, but it doesn't mean I have to have my mind changed if I'm willing to listen. So that's one way to think about it. You still believe, and you might be wrong, but it's okay to believe it. Like I can believe that other side's worse, but still not want to be part of making the toxic polarization worse. You can simultaneously do those things without kind of violating your principles, if you know what I mean, right?
I'm curious, and I don't know if you have any information on this, but how does political outrage influence voter behavior and participation? Does it mobilize voters, do you think, or does it alienate them?
Yeah, it's a great question. It probably does a little bit of both. When you look at some of these studies, and obviously the politicians think it motivates people, right? It mobilizes them because they use this stuff all the time. Like they're trying to tell you how terrible the other candidate is all the time. So they think it works for them. If you look at studies about some of this, you do see, a larger group that you do see some segment at least that is sort of saying, I'm sort of over it. Like it caused me to tune out. It's causing me to be less civically engaged, more cynical. And so it might have a kind of a negative backfire effect at some point. Like it might work for the base, and it might drive out some of the base, which is, of course, what they need to do. So it makes sense for them to do that. But it might be causing more moderate, more maybe somewhat less politically active people to be less engaged. And so we might be, but we didn't see it in 2020. We saw pretty high voter turnout then. It's still low internationally, though. I mean, globally, our numbers are still kind of low, but it was high for American voters. So we'll kind of see, but it looks like some studies are saying there are people that are tuning out because of it, right? Like they're getting cynical. They're tuning out from politics in general, and they're less likely to vote. So I don't think it's a definitive answer yet, but you're seeing some indications that there are folks that are turned off by it.
So how can politicians and public figures contribute to lowering the temperature of political discourse while still advocating for their positions?
Yeah, I think the advocating for their positions part is not that hard. I mean, I think they can do that pretty easily. The challenge that they face in our political climate is that it's very dangerous in some way for them to uh, that their constituencies see collaboration and cooperation as appeasement, right? Or even just sort of tolerance they see as appeasement, right? So this is kind of on us. Like we have to make that a something we champion a little bit more. Um, and like we talked about in the beginning, America was built on this model that you need basically to work with people you don't agree with, like you don't even like them necessarily, and you have to be able to coexist and work together on things. And it's the only way that anything happens in our system of government, because a lot of people have this fantasy that they'll have a dominant majority, and that'll be our solution to all of our problems. Like we'll dominate for some just perpetually long time, and it's just not realistic if you look at the history. I mean, if anything, it's gotten less so, right? I mean, you used to see
Yeah.
more swings, and you might have Democrats sort of with a pretty good majority for a while, and then you see Republicans with a pretty good majority. You don't really see that now. These swings are very much smaller. It's very tight windows, a few percentage points one way or the other. The last 25 years have been that way, and there's been a trend before that. But so I don't see that being an option anytime soon, that either side's going to somehow just dominate the other side. Look at this election. I mean, this is going to be so close. And both sides say the same thing. Both sides say, I can't believe it's this close. Like my candidate's so good, they should just be dominating this election, right? They both believe it. They both believe the other side is a threat to democracy. They might have a different definition of what democracy means, but they both answer that question saying they think the opponent is a threat to democracy. So I don't see that as being an answer. That one side's going to dominate, and what that means, to get back to another place we started, was civil war or not. We basically have a couple of options there, right? I mean, if one side isn't going to dominate, then throw that one out. Then another option is civil war. Okay, and where does that lead us, and how does that get us anywhere? Obviously, that's not going to be great. That wouldn't be good. The other option is we find a way to have like conflict, like we find a way to deal with conflict, to um, coexist in a way that is less toxic. And we won't always get what we want. No one's gonna neither side's gonna get what they want, and coming to live with that, which we're not, and we're really unhappy not getting what we want now, and we're not getting everything we want, and so that's something we're going to have to get better about, because we're not always going to get what we want. And I realize there are some things you can't compromise on, like somebody's life you can't take half a life or not, right? So there's some things that are a lot harder to compromise on, but there's a ton of stuff where there's a lot more room for collaboration and compromise. And we, the constituencies of these politicians, have to make that something we champion more. But part of that problem in our country is because of gerrymandering, right? And there's so many safe districts, that with these safe districts, you've probably talked about this on your show before, but
Yes.
with this increase of safe districts, I think it's gone from somewhere around half, maybe less than half, to 80% or more now, I think it is. In these safe districts, what happens is the primary electors pretty much decide who the candidate's going to be, or who the winner's going to be, because they're going to win. It's a red or it's a blue district, and that's, once they win the primary, they are going to win the election. So that means this, and the primary voters are the most extreme voters, and they're also a very small minority, right? Not everybody votes in primaries. So what you have electing the vast majority of our representatives these days is this small majority of the most extreme people. And so because they're afraid of that uh, those primary voters in their district, they have to hold these extreme views, or they'll disappoint those primary voters and lose. And what, Trump threatens, he's going to primary somebody all the time. He figured this out, right? I mean, he figured out this primary thing, and now he uses it like a weapon. And so this is a problem that it makes it very difficult for a politician to, publicly say they're supporting working with somebody on the other side. We're working on a bill together. Where I support their bill, or they support my bill, and this kind of thing. Like, it's very hard to do that, because you're like a traitor, to my side. You're an apostate, because you don't take this hardline stand. And we have to get out of that mode. That's just, we've been trained, like I said, through media the 60 years of this messaging that we've been dealing with, that we've fallen into it, that we believe this stuff now. And some of that's going to be improved with more better civics education about how our government works, better general education about, you know, it, it, all the media stuff we talked about and all that. So some of that is just getting better educated and not realizing we're not doing ourselves any favors to act this way. We're making things worse. But that's so theoretically, if politicians, didn't have that fear of their own constituency, especially their primary voters, yeah, I mean, there's a lot they could do, right? I mean, and you see this with Spencer Cox in Utah does some of this where they did like an ad campaign, the Republicans and his Republican opponent, or I should say his Democratic opponent, Spencer Cox is Republican. They had his Democratic opponent, and they would do these commercials together where they would say like, hey, I don't agree with this guy, but he's a good guy and he's a dad. And, they would sort of try to bring the humanity to it. And we're going to fight hard for our positions, but we're both Americans, and America, comes first, and this kind of thing. So I think politicians can do that kind of thing more. And that's only one example. There's some more of that going around. So I think politicians, and I think this is another case where the media lets us down, that they don't highlight these things very much because it's not what sells, right? Nobody wants to see politicians getting along. Who wants that? So they don't highlight this enough. So it's hard to find those stories so then we get a skewed perspective of it. Like, because I know there's a lot of local issues around the country. There's a lot of organizations working on bringing communities together across the political divide to work on community issues that are really important in those communities. And it's much easier to find, to work across the divide when you see these kind of community issues where, yeah, everybody knows we have this, I don't know, pothole problem or whatever it is. And they're much more likely to sort of set aside those party differences to work on some of these problems. So there's groups out there kind of trying to identify those kinds of problems and bring groups together to work on them. And there's of course groups working on the harder problems too, that like the ones that aren't so easy, that kind of the intractable conflicts, and trying to work on that as well. And that's an area that people spend a lot of energy, and there's a bunch of scientists and others and experts working on just getting us better at conflict resolution and conflict dialogue. And that's a whole space. But that's, I think, one of the big things politicians could do more. They could highlight that humanity and sort of the morality of the other side. Even if we don't agree on issues, but there may be 2 or 3 issues we can find compromise on, or whatever. There may be these kinds of issues we can work together on. We're going to work on the national something. I don't know. They can find something, but we're going to hold our stance here, and I'm going to fight for my side. But this person is still a good person. They are family man. Blah blah blah. So I think there's a lot more of that kind of stuff people could do. That's kind of my dream rally, is we sort of have a big rally of Democrats and Republicans together, kind of, still firm on their positions, but accepting that all of us are Americans. We all want to work. We all have, America's best interests at heart, even if we don't agree what that might be. But we aren't fundamentally evil trying to, inflict harm.
How can families and friends who have differing ideologies, different political beliefs, how can they engage in healthy conversations without succumbing to outrage and just breaking off the relationship altogether?
Yeah, it's really hard, and there are a lot of trainings and things like that you can take. If you go to like one organization that I work with, it's called Crossing Party Lines. They have a lot of documents and training courses you can take to try to work on some of that dialogue. But some of it's as simple as learning to listen a little bit. So kind of practicing some active listening. And one thing about that is really listening. Like, it's easy to say I'm going to listen, but if you're kind of listening, waiting to talk, and it actually means you really do want to understand, right? This is one of the ways I like to think of it. If you're going to have a dialogue with somebody with a different view, is try to turn it into, let's go on a little detective story adventure together, and try to understand why we see this differently. Instead of, I'm going to try to convince you to think like I do, and you're going to try to convince me to think like you do. Let's instead let's create another goal, which is to both understand better why we look at this differently. And if you go in it like that, we're in this together as our little detectives together. We're going to arrive at why we see it differently. That's a good way to diffuse it a little bit. That can help, at least. I always recommend, if you're going to start having these conversations, start with listening only. Like, don't even respond yet. Maybe think about some things you might want to respond to later or not, but just really try to listen and listen genuinely. That's the trick. You have to be, if you're not committed to listen genuinely, then you're not ready for the conversation. But if you're committed to listen genuinely and actually do want to understand why they believe some of the things they believe, start there. Like spend some time, maybe the first conversation, just listen for a while and don't really add your views yet. And then later say, hey, we talked for an hour or whatever last time, and I let you share a lot. Are you okay if I share my position a little bit? And I think the fact that you did that, they'll be a little bit more open. And you can maybe then start having that dialogue. I also encourage folks to mix in physical activity. So if you can have that dialogue on a walk, it's better. It's just proven scientifically, neurologically, that if you're active like that, you're going to have better ability to deal with complex problems while your brain is having that physical mobility. So it doesn't, a lot of people think that sounds stupid, but it actually is pretty much very, very well known. So if you can mix in a physical activity, that's better. If you can't, okay, maybe you can't, but I would start with listening, and really try to actually understand. Like, don't just pretend to listen and say, I'm going to spend 45 minutes and sit here not say anything, but actually engage and like say, oh, they just said a thing. And then maybe ask a clarifying question, like, did you mean this or something like that? But don't necessarily push back and change anything or try to change their mind or anything yet. If you even ever want to change your mind. I don't even say change your mind should even necessarily be a goal. But and then maybe that, like I said, that might open up a chance for then your next conversation or two conversations later. You can say, hey, I've given you a lot of time to say some of your views. Is it okay if I share my views? And I guess they have the right to say no. I doubt hardly anyone would say no, right? They're probably going to say, hey, I guess you're right. And at that point, you've also got a bit of a rapport. I mean, another thing that can really help is to have some connections that go beyond politics. So like if you both like a football, sports team, or you both like to play video games or something, if you don't already know each other, spend some time doing that other activity, like before you break into the politics for a while, right? Just go, hey, you want to go play cards? Like, I know you like to play cards, or we both like to play cards, or, hey, I saw the new, whatever game came out. Let's go try it out together, and spend some time doing that. That'll help break down, or at least create the humanity side. Like, this is a normal person who does normal things, and I can have fun with, and they're funny, and they, that kind of thing, right? So if that's an opportunity, you can also do some of that. That'll help prepare for it. There's actually, if you want to talk to a potential Trump supporter, there's a bot out there called Angry Uncle. You can play online with that. It's like a chat GPT type thing. And you can have a conversation with Angry Uncle. And Angry Uncle also has some, like, you can give it a prompt like, hey, I'm sort of stuck now. I'm like really mad now and I'm stuck. What can I do? And Angry Uncle will like give you some ideas of how you might handle that situation. And Angry Uncle is a little bit easier to do probably than a real person in some way. First of all, it's probably not going to hurt your feelings that bad because it's a robot. But and you're not going to probably you don't care if you break the relationship with the robot. But also it's a little, I think, more responsive than a real person is. You probably have to spend more time breaking down that trust, or getting that trust, I should say, building that trust, than you do with the bot. The bot will start to build trust faster than a real human will. Because usually you have to spend some time building some trust. Because these people, everyone that's gone into political conversations has been, burnt in some way, right? And so we're all very touchy about it, and we're sort of expecting to be, it's a gotcha. They're trying to trick me, or you're gonna change my mind. It's like, well, I might, but I'm like, it's weird that you're afraid of that, because it's like, but yeah, so that's a few things that I would recommend, is that there are ways to and there are some skills here, like, and so this is why having short conversations first, maybe, or don't go too far, because there are some skills here. So you could also do something like a Braver Angels conversation, or Crossing Party Lines has ongoing conversations, so you can do more than just one. And then you get some actual practice interacting with folks that have differing opinions than you. And you can get some exposure to other people having those kind of back and forths. So you can kind of see how other people do it in a moderated situation where nothing's going to get, out of hand, because the moderator will control that. So, but you can build those skills by having those conversations and thinking about what are some good ways to present, or deal with those conversations. So those are a few of the ones I would recommend. It's touchy waters. Obviously, it's not easy to have these kind of conversations. And if you go in with the goal that I'm going to have 3 conversations and they're going to suddenly think the way I think,
Right.
you're setting yourself up for some pretty bad failure, because they think the same thing about you,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they think you've got the wrong ideas and they want to change your mind.
Yeah, it's that whole, again, us versus them mentality that we get trapped into. We're almost out of time, so I want to get to your podcast again. Where can people find you?
So yeah, they can find everything at outrageoverload.net. Sometimes I think I must have a little bit of a speech impediment because people think I'm saying outrage overlord, but it's outrage it's outrage overload, like a kind of an overloaded truck. So it's outrageoverload.net. There's a contact page with all my contacts, but socials are like Outrage Overload is also the socials. And I have an email, outrageoverload@gmail.com. Always looking for feedback and input. What direction, you think I could do better? What direction could the show go? I think the environment episode you just mentioned, that was kind of a new experiment. It's my first episode talking about the environment. And frankly, it has I'm getting some mixed feedback on that from my listeners. Some people are really into it. Some think I've gone off the rails.
Really?
Yeah, I haven't quite figured out why well, maybe not gone off the rails, but it's not like it does. It's not quite they don't think it fits as well in sort of the theme of the show, but I think it does.
I thought it was great, and I thought it fit in perfectly. So,
well, there you go. You're in that camp. Thank you.
That's my opinion. Thank you so much, David, for joining the show. I really appreciate it. I've had a great time here. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you for being so generous with your time as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I know we ran a little long, but I guess I was kind of on a roll there. So sorry.
No, hey, that's not a problem. Perfect. Thank you so much again. And for everybody else, we will see you next week. This has been Coup Save America with Sean Sainhart and David Beckemeyer.